Hello, church family. It's 7:30 on Monday night, and that means it's time for our devotionals. So if you have a Bible, open up to 1 Peter chapter 1. Now, this past Sunday, our sermon looked at verses 3 to 9 from 1 Peter. But tonight, I'd like us to look at the first two verses from chapter 1. So chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. As you're turning there, let me just say that we are still working to try to find ways to connect and to care. I've heard from many of you who say that you've been getting your phone calls and people have been praying with you. And so we are excited about that, trying to find ways to care for one another during this unprecedented time. Also, it's been a great treat for me to see on the Sunday School at Home feed the pictures of your kids with their crafts. Just a wonderful way for us to continue to disciple our children, even as we are all at home. Okay, 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who are elect exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, according to the foreknowledge of God the Father and the sanctification of the Spirit, for obedience to Jesus Christ and for sprinkling with his blood. May grace and peace be multiplied to you. Well, let's jump right in off the top. So Peter identifies himself here not only as the author of this letter, but also as an apostle of Jesus Christ. Now, apostle in this sense is a technical term. It means that he was one who was with Jesus. He witnessed the resurrected Jesus, and he was commissioned to be sent out with the message of Jesus to the world. And so the word apostle itself in Greek simply means sent out one. But there were some of these guys who were sent out uniquely and commissioned by Jesus, and one of them happened to be Peter. And so when Peter writes this letter, it's different than when other Christians write a letter. It's different than when I send an email out or whatever, because Peter has been commissioned by an apostle of Jesus Christ. And so he's writing to a bunch of people, and that's what it says next. He's writing to those who are elect exiles of the dispersion, and then it names different geographical regions. What's interesting here is that Peter is writing to various groups and pockets of Christians in these different areas, and he identifies them as elect exiles. I want to take a moment to think about what that means. First of all, this idea of being an exile. You know, when Peter says that, he's not meaning it literally, that these people are exiles, but what he's talking about is something metaphorical. It's a deep truth for all Christians. When we are Christians, we have our true citizenship not in this world, but in another world. And so we find ourselves living out our Christian life in exile, if you will. You know, this idea of being here but not truly from here. You know, you're sort of, in one sense, displaced. And as Christians, you feel that regularly. You can often feel like an exile in the culture. You can look around and you see that, man, I just don't really feel in some ways like I fit in. And so what's the role of an exile? If Christians are exiles in this world and in this culture, our true citizenship is a heavenly one. Well, while we're here, it's a normal thing to feel slightly out of place, like we don't fit in. But what's critically important is that when we find ourselves in this world as exiles, that we remain rooted in our true identity. I don't know about you, but this last week or so has definitely brought out a lot of those exile feelings for me. I look around the world's going crazy, uncertainty around every turn, not only with the virus, but with the fallout from the virus. And in fact, just today, our premier declared a state of emergency for the entire province and has said that as of midnight tomorrow, all non-essential businesses and places of work and industry have to be closed down. I mean, this is serious times. And you look around and as a Christian, you're like, my goodness, I kind of feel like an exile even in my own home, even in my own province. But Peter goes on to nail down what really matters. It's in those moments when we feel exiled, when we come to grips with the reality of our exile, that we need to return back to our true identity. So what does Peter say about our true identity? Well, he writes this group and he calls them not only exiles, but he calls them elect exiles. And that's something we need to remind ourselves of. We are not orphans who've been far flung in this world. Our true home is in heaven and we're hard done by, we're far flung in this world. No, we are actually sent and commissioned here on exile as the elect, as the chosen ones. So when Peter's writing this letter to these churches, to these gatherings of Christians, the vast majority of those Christians would have been Gentiles back then. But what he's saying is, in the same way that Israel was God's chosen people and elect, when you read the Bible, the Old Testament stories, you see that God chose Israel, not because they were special, not because they were great, not because they were powerful, but because they were the least. So his glory could be demonstrated through this people who were actually weak and fragile and fought against God. In that same way, Peter's saying, if you are a Christian, you are God's elect. Not because you're awesome, not because you're strong, not because you're great, but because he has chosen you. Elect exiles. We have to remind ourselves of our identity. He then goes on and he says more about our identity. He says, according to the foreknowledge of God the Father. Well, this is another beautiful piece of encouragement from the gospel. This truth that God knew you from before the foundation of the world. You were in the heart of God from before the universe even began. That's the foreknowledge of God the Father, that he chose you to be one of the elect even at that time before you were born, before anything existed. Your salvation, your electness was in the heart of God the Father. It's a great reminder when you find yourself in exile. He then goes on and says, in the sanctification of the Spirit. Well, sanctification is a word that gets kicked around sometimes in church. We don't exactly, sometimes think about what it means. But in fact, sanctification is the process whereby every Christian person ought to be growing more and more into the image of Christ, looking more and more like Jesus, and less like the world around them. That's the sanctification of the Spirit. Now, if you look at your life and you say, gosh, RD, I'm really trying, I'm really putting forth an effort as an elect exile who is in the foreknowledge of God the Father, I'm putting forth an effort to try to be sanctified, well, then you're going about it all wrong, because Peter says that this is actually a work of the Spirit. I think too often Christians, they're satisfied to be saved by grace, but then when it comes to sanctification, they very quickly turn it into something that we have to do. We grab ourselves by the bootstraps and make ourselves better. No, that's not it at all. That's not it at all. We allow the Holy Spirit of God to sanctify us and to change our desires, to change our hearts. And I think at times like this, when many of us are at home and many more will be home after tomorrow, we have a lot of time on our hands. Perhaps it's a good thing to use some of that time intentionally to spend time with Jesus, to spend time with the Lord, and find that as you begin to spend more time intentionally with him in prayer, in Bible study, in devotionals like this, you will find that the very Spirit of God is changing you from the inside out. It's part of who you are. It's inevitable as a Christian, as an elect exile, that sanctification will be one of the marks of your life, sanctification of the Spirit. Okay, so elect exiles, according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, these are all traits of who you are. This is your identity in Christ. Sanctification of the Spirit. And then he says, for obedience to Jesus Christ and for sprinkling with his blood. Now this image of sprinkling with his blood, that's probably a little uncomfortable, especially if you're sort of new to Christianity. But it's actually, again, an Old Testament image. The mercy seat, the hilasterion in the Old Testament, was kept in the Holy of Holies. And once a year, the high priest would go in and he would sprinkle it with the blood of an animal sacrifice, of an offering. And that was intended to be a picture of God's wrath being satisfied. You know, this idea is underlined by the fact that we all live under the wrath of God, that we all deserve death and hell. But that Jesus Christ, see, this is our identity piece as elect exiles, that by Jesus Christ has sprinkled his blood, and therefore we no longer live under the wrath of God, but we live under his mercy. God's wrath has been satisfied toward us. This is part of who we are as elect exiles. The foreknowledge of God the Father, sanctification of the Spirit, obedience to Jesus Christ, and for sprinkling with his blood. And then Peter finishes this opening greeting with words that we need to hear today. He says, "May grace and peace be multiplied to you." Friends, as elect exiles, I pray that even now, the grace and peace of God would be multiplied to you. You know, this time of quarantine and lockdown, I think is going to bring about a lot of hardship for a lot of people. You know, sometimes in very practical, pragmatic, concrete ways, like needed for food and medication and money and all that stuff. But I also think it's going to exacerbate some of the problems that already exist in a lot of our relationships and in our own hearts. And we're going to be talking about that on Sunday. I was just told actually today by Len that following this lockdown that happened in Wuhan, China, there has actually been a massive increase. Like, the courts are inundated with people filing for divorce. You know, I think people find themselves in these relationships. They're able to manage them as long as both parties are able to pursue their hobbies or their sports or their work or whatever, their careers. But then you stick people into a house together over an extended period of time, and inevitably you're going to have hardship. It's just going to take all of that stuff that's been underlying for so long and bring it to the surface and exacerbate it and make it so much more difficult. And so the word from 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 1 and 2 today for you, for your household, is this: as elect exiles, may grace and peace be multiplied to you. Well, friends, we'll see you again on Wednesday. God bless you and have a good night.